Welcome to Classics Confidential on location in New York. It's a great pleasure to welcome my colleague Elizabeth Macaulay-Lewis at the Graduate Center, City University of New York.
Yeah.
Welcome, Lizzie.
Delighted to be here. Actually, delighted to have you in New York. It's wonderful that we could do this here today.
And actually our topic fits in beautifully because we're going to be talking about the Greek and Roman influences on New York architecture, which I know you're working on, Lizzie, so tell us more about it.
Okay, well, one thing I think whenever you come to New York, you think big skyscrapers, you think the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, the Freedom Tower, all of these kind of iconic buildings of kind of the modern period. And so in some senses it's a little bit funny to think about Greco-Roman things, but actually in fact New York is really scattered with all of them. And that's been something I've been looking at, which is why these classical buildings, columns, arches, things that we would expect to find in Roman cities are kind of everywhere in New York when you just start to look a little bit earlier. Actually, New York itself is built on a grid plan, most of the city, and that was purposefully designed at the turn of the 19th century in order to organize Manhattan, to allow it to expand, very much to kind of have great commercial endeavors and so that they could succeed. So.
The conference I'm attending is taking place around Washington Square, so a great sort of monument is the Washington Arch, which is, you know, Roman style.
Yes, well, that's also an arch with a lot of interesting history. So it sits at the bottom of Fifth Avenue, and behind it is Washington Square Park. So it's this heart of Greenwich Village, very cool, very popular part of town. But at the end of one of New York's kind of major thoroughfares, iconic Fifth Avenue, you know, where all the glitzy shops are, you end up in the heart of Greenwich Village at this very elegant white Roman arch. And it's kind of a funny thing because it's not at all what you expect. But actually there's a wonderful history behind it. So the arch is the first classical style arch built anywhere in America. There's a kind of Gothic example earlier in Hartford, Connecticut. But this one was about the centennial and celebrating the centennial of the inauguration of George Washington, the first president of the United States. Early American literature is littered with references, particularly to Latin literature, the parallels of kind of Washington with Cincinnatus, the good, you know, farmer who goes to fight and then goes back to his land, which is kind of what George Washington does. He goes, he serves as president, and he goes back to Virginia. So proper Roman, in a good sense, a good Republican Roman, not evil Empire Roman. Of
course not.
Of course not. But so Americans were very, very proud of their first president, and so 100 years later, to celebrate his inauguration, William Stewart Rylander, who was a major figure in, William Rylander Stewart, a major figure in kind of property, very much part of the New York establishment, decided that they ought to have a big temporary arch as part of the celebrations. Actually, there were a couple built in the city, but the most famous one was built a couple of blocks north of where the arch is today.
Ah, so it's actually switched location.
It has moved
really
a little bit, because New Yorkers, I think, would have complained and would have said it was in the way. Like most New Yorkers are always complaining about something and someone's in the way. Everybody, the arch was designed, so the original arch was temporary, and it was made of staff, which is kind of paper mache. So there was a wooden frame, it was covered in white staff, there was a statue of George Washington, stuffed eagles, bunting, flags, very patriotic, and it was built by Stanford White, who was one of the kind of great American architects. So he was a founding member of the firm McKim, Mead & White, which built some of the most famous buildings in New York City, but also in Newport. He's quite a colorful character. He's definitely a ladies' man. He eventually dies as a jealous husband shoots him on the the roof of Madison Square Garden. But before his
Greek tragedy there.
Very much Greek tragedy. It's a very good moral lesson of what you should not be doing in your spare time. But while he left us earlier than perhaps he would have done otherwise, he built some remarkable structures. And this temporary arch was one of the first things that he did. And it was a huge hit. So it was built for the celebration. So not only was it built and people could look at it, but the parades. And this notion of spectacle and parading. And it immediately starts to think about triumphal processions, and we are going to parade, you know, soldiers and, you know, young men in training down Fifth Avenue and under the arch. So it creates something that I think they clearly were aware of the arch as in itself a kind of physical landmark, but also you can do things to it, that it's a kind of interactive form of art that you're dealing with. It's not just something that's off the side and is decorative.
And also, I mean, it creates a very interesting parallel to sort of Roman processions, triumphal processions. And I mean, the fact that it was really popular is interesting.
Well, and it's also interesting because it's part of a larger, there's this larger tradition of kind of processing, if you will, within New York, or parades.
Yes.
For Columbus, when they celebrate in, you know, the 400th anniversary of Columbus discovering America, there's the erection of the column of Columbus, which is where Columbus Circle is today. And so, you know, people often go by and wonder why Columbus is up a column. It's because Italian Americans felt very strongly about celebrating the 400th anniversary. And there was a huge parade down that way that also passed by Columbus, what is now today Columbus Circle, but it's this whole tradition. And today we don't really have armies or soldiers, we have sports teams. So when the New York Giants won the Super Bowl, there's a ticker tape parade. When the Yankees win the World Series, which seems to have recently been quite regularly, or the Mets, you know, it's a big to-do. And so this thing that originates as kind of a Roman concept and celebration of warfare is routinely lived out in New York City, and whether it's sports parades or, as we just had St. Patrick's Day on Monday, you know, Irish Americans go out and parade and wear banners and things like that. So it's amazing to see this kind of genesis of an idea and how it develops and flourishes and is reinterpreted by multiple different parts of Americans today.
Well, that's very interesting, because going back to ancient Greece, of course, sport and warfare were very closely linked, and, you know, some of the processes were very similar, and sort of celebrating both military and sporting victories is very important for civic pride.
Yeah, well, it's this kind of notion is you know, sport is war by other means, and
Precisely.
it seems to kind of live its sense out here. And it's also interesting when we come back to a moment to take it back to the arch, the Washington Square arch. That arch touches on these topics as well. So the original temporary arch was such a success that they decided to raise the money to build a permanent one. It took them a bit of time, but eventually they got the arch up. The statues were added much later on, but the statues are of Washington as a general, as a kind of Washington at war and Washington at peace. That this connection to why we celebrate him as a president is also tied to his ability to lead. But part of that is militaristic, and part of that is also him being you know, able to lead in time of peace with, you know, laws and following justice. But it's very much also the general. I mean, he did beat the British.
Yes.
and everyone kind of remembers that. And that was something that was celebrated and important. And it's something that we see in some of the other arches that are around New York City, too. So we have an arch in Brooklyn called the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, and that is a big arch that is dedicated to the veterans of the, basically of the men who fought for the Union in the American Civil War, who were from Brooklyn. And that is also very triumphal. It has a huge statue on top of it, which is deemed to be Columbia, not Victory. But if you were a Romanist, you would have been very confused, because she looks exactly like a Victory. She's walking, she's got a chariot in front of her, and horses on the side, and it's incredibly imperial.
So, I mean, it's interesting that these New York architects were taking sort of ancient symbols and then refashion them, reusing them for a new purpose, which is to celebrate American ideals and, of course, New York civic pride.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and it's interesting that part of it also seems to come through very much through the lens of Europe. I mean, you know, Americans were certainly looking to England, looking to France for artistic inspiration. So the Arc de Triomphe is a major, kind of, if you will, it's like a reflecting point,
yes.
which you can see classical forms like the Arch of Titus, which are being reinterpreted, or the Arch of Constantine. Both of those they're going to make appearances in various different forms, whether it's the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, the Arc de Triomphe, or then Marble Arch, Wellington's Arch in London, and all of these things, many of which are kind of being built in either the late 18th century or the early 19th century, are all things that a lot of these architects would have seen or been aware of. So part of it is engaging with classical culture, but also a kind of way of saying we have as much culture as all those Europeans do. We're not Nouveau, we're not Arabiste. So it becomes this very sophisticated way in which artists are also doing something, probably tells us something about the artistic production, the culture of art and architecture at this specific moment, as well as how Americans interacted with classical culture. Other than to say as classical culture was clearly the thing.
Yes.
It's a major reference point. It's what people were educated in. And that was where a lot of America's elites and the great patrons of architecture looked in terms of their ideas, and their education was highly classical as well.
Yes, I mean, and that was the thing that they had in common, of course, with their counterparts in Europe. So there was a sort of transatlantic conversation happening, but in the form of, you know, material culture, which is so exciting. And, you know, if you're interested in this topic, there'll be a lot more in Elizabeth's article in a forthcoming volume entitled War, a Spectacle. Moving on from the arches, were there other types of architecture, whether Greek or Roman, that New York architects felt had something to say to the American public?
Yeah, there are, and it's quite interesting. Temples are a very popular one. They always seem to turn up as banks. It's very popular. They kind of, a lot in Philadelphia, a lot in New York, where there's kind of this, you know, I think that they're very traditional, they're very solemn, they have an idea of strength. But also probably one of our most iconic buildings looks like the front of a Greco-Roman temple, and that's Wall Street. That's Wall Street's New York Stock Exchange, which has these massive Corinthian columns and also has a pedimental frieze. And the pedimental frieze is actually all about American industry and American agriculture. And so it was designed by George Post, who was another well-known American architect. And I think his son was actually a member of the Exchange. To be a member of the Exchange, you had to buy a seat, because traditionally they sat under a tree, a buttonwood tree, I believe, and you had to buy a seat. So you still have to buy a seat if you want to trade on the New York Stock Exchange. They run for a couple $1 million, I think, as opposed to as opposed to what we're sitting in now. But that is a way of kind of saying that building was deemed to be the appropriate type of facade. For these financial industries, and this kind of tradition and strength that were seen in those buildings, that you could kind of trust them.
Yeah, stability.
Stability. And almost, it's funny, the best manifestation is probably a building that's actually very close to the New York Stock Exchange, which is the Bankers Trust Building, which is ostensibly a skyscraper. But the top of it looks like the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus. And so it has a kind of, you know, I think it's got columns running around the sides, and then it has a kind of step roof pyramid. And it was, again, this notion that kind of classical building forms were solid and sturdy. And so this building, with its very odd roof on top, which it's
a weird combination.
It's a weird combination.
Modern and ancient.
Modern and ancient stuck on top. Although it's not the only building. There are actually a bunch scattered down in Lower Manhattan that have kind of architectural interpretations of the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus stopped on top. There are actually at least 3 buildings. So it wasn't just this one-off that did it. So the building got used as the symbol for the Bankers Trust there, but also it kind of speaks to these 2 levels of cities. That there's what you can see on the ground, and you want to be impressive on the ground, but it's also who can see you up above and what you can see. So the tops of buildings become very interesting talking points. So these early skyscrapers, which are in many ways like a traditional column, they're kind of tripartite. They have a kind of base, they have a shaft, and they have a top. And that was one of the ways that early architectural critics kind of referred to some of our original skyscrapers as being like columns. So even the way that people were conceptualizing new buildings in many ways was using an architectural framework that originated in antiquity.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Lizzie, for talking to us on Classics Confidential.
Thank you for having me.